All right, welcome to English Comp. In this video, we're going to go through some specifics for writing, right? So we're kind of past some of the big picture thinking. I want to get into some more specifics about what we're looking for in terms of writing style, some things you should know when you're putting together your actual sentences, and we're going to kind of get away from the big picture of what the paper should look like and start, focusing in on some more detail. So the first thing I want to think about here is sentence length. So whenever you're writing a particular paper, now any one writer is going to have different issues than somebody else, right? So for some people that are going to take this course, sentence length is not an issue for you. For some people it is. I have noticed that a lot of beginning writers tend to make really long sentences because in their mind their thought is still going, right? And so then I end up with sentences that are very long, typically. So as a general rule, and until you become a really good writer, you don't want your sentences being much over about 20 words. Now you don't need to go in and count, but if you figure out about what 20 words is, you don't want to go much over that. You don't want to be having a lot of 30 and 40-word sentences, particularly at the beginning of your writing development, because it takes a lot of punctuation and a lot of skill to make a long sentence correct, right? So it's a little easier if you keep the sentence level a little bit smaller. So probably somewhere around 20 word would be a good general rule, because in order to make a long sentence that actually reads correctly, it's actually kind of hard. And in fact, in writing, it is easier sometimes to be long-winded, right? So somebody's got a rambling sentence, that kind of thing. It's easier to be long-winded than it is concise. So concise means you got to the point clearly, articulately. It didn't take you more words than it should have to get your point across, right? That's concise. I remember a story one time, it is a true story, I believe, of a guy that wrote something. I think it was during one of the wars, maybe the Civil War, perhaps one of the French wars, but he wrote, and he said, "I'm too pressed for time to write you a short letter, so I'm going to have to write you this long one instead." So what does he mean by that? I'm too pressed for time. In other words, I don't have enough time to write you a short letter. I'm going to have to write you this long one instead. Because when you initially write something, in order to make it clear and concise, it takes more thought. And so what he was saying is that it would actually take him longer to write one short and clear and concise and convey the same information in a short amount of time. So he's just going to write it quickly, which is going to make it longer, right? So anyways, the idea behind all of that is that long-winded things are not necessarily better. Really long sentences are not necessarily better. They're not more academic or anything like that. So you want to avoid really long sentences. What you're after is that sweet spot. You don't want to have just really short, abrupt sentences that don't make a good point, that aren't artistic at all in style, but you don't want something too long either. So you're looking for a nice middle ground of something that is not a real long run-on sentence, but hits the point clearly and in a good way. All right. You want to vary your sentence length a little bit sometimes. These are style things, right? So you don't have to have 20-word sentences for every single sentence. Every once in a while, for style, a short sentence breaks it up a little bit. Maybe you get a quote in there that's a little longer. That breaks it up a little bit. If your quotes are longer, that's okay, because you can have more than one sentence in your quotes. So if you have a little longer quote to kind of break things up. So these are just things, not necessarily that you have to think about when you're writing your first draft, but when you're coming back in to revise and do your revisions for a second draft or a third draft, these are some things that you think about. You look at that and say, are all my sentences the same length? Is that kind of boring, hard to read? Maybe I mix things up a little bit here, turn this sentence into two smaller ones. Things like that are stylistic things that you do, because once you start growing in your ability to write, you kind of get past just thinking, did I say what I wanted to say, and start getting into, did I say it with good style, right? Does my writing look professional? Does it have variety to it? So those are some skills that you'll develop, right? Trouble with a long sentence, additionally, if you've got a reader, is that a long sentence for a reader can be harder to follow, right? I've all had that experience where you're reading something and you kind of get lost in the middle. You're saying, hey, well, what would they say? You got to go back and start over. If you have a really long sentence, which I get a lot in homework sometimes, halfway through, you're having to go back to the beginning again and try and remember what it was that they were talking about when they started the sentence, you know? So most of the time, really long sentence is actually 5 or 6 sentences that they just didn't put periods in and make them into new sentences. They just ran it all together and put an and in there instead of a period or something like that, and they just had this one really long sentence. Okay. A general rule of thumb is one main idea per sentence, right? So you don't want your sentences trying to cover 2 different ideas. If it's 2 different ideas, it should be 2 different sentences. Okay. The next thing that I want to look at is thought precision. Thought precision, right? So the idea of saying what you want to say in the best possible way. That's thought precision, right? That you're not rambling, that you're not using a bunch of unnecessary words, that you say what you want to say with precision, right? The difference between a beginning medical student and a surgeon who's been doing surgeries their whole life is their precision with the cuts that they make. They don't have a lot of wasted movement. They're not making a bigger cut than necessary so that it takes longer to heal. They're precise. It's what makes a surgeon who's very precise a well-paid surgeon, because it's hard to find someone that's super precise. And so if you are super precise in your cuts, then you become more valuable in the medical field. Same thing with writing. You don't want to waste a lot of words with ums and, you know, like how when you talk, sometimes you kind of ramble because you're thinking about it while you're saying it. A lot of times people bring that into their writing and they ramble a little bit. So I want to think of thought precision in this way. You want to be interestingly clear. Mm-hmm. Interestingly clear. Okay. Avoid trying to use a bunch of big words for no reason, right? Sometimes people think it sounds more academic if they use a big word. Sometimes people have a thesaurus and they'll type in a word and the computer will give them 8 words that mean the same thing, and they may even have ever used that word before, but it's big and it sounds impressive, and so they'll start putting in big words into their writing. So don't do that. If you use a thesaurus, make sure you know the word. It's a word that you're familiar with. You will come across as fake in your writing if you're using a bunch of big words, particularly if you're not really sure about what they mean. You're liable to use them out of context a little bit. But what you're wanting is for it to be your words. Now, as you're writing, reading, becoming an advanced student, your vocabulary should naturally advance as well. So that as you're doing your reading, when you come across words that you don't know, you should look them up. Because part of being a good student is not just being exposed to new concepts, but it's also broadening your vocabulary so that the words that you're able to use are more broad, right? If you have a greater vocabulary from which you're drawing words from, then correspondingly you should have a broader writing style, right? So expand your vocabulary through your reading and your study. Try to avoid using your writing as time to throw in a bunch of big words that you don't know what they mean, right? As you study and your vocabulary grows, incorporate those words in. You will come across sounding phony if you use a whole bunch of big words, and then you really lose your reader. Sometimes, you know, I mean, you can go out and find in a thesaurus a bunch of big words that will make it sound really, you know, like some genius wrote it. But then you're only going to have geniuses who can read it, right? So we want our reading to be us, right? To be our voice coming through. Okay. Not trying to impress people with our writing, right? But we are trying to grow in our writing skill. Right? The idea behind writing is communication, right? You have to be able to communicate your thought effectively, and if you don't, then your writing didn't reach its purpose, right? The purpose of writing is to communicate your thinking clearly to someone else. So when you use these large words that you don't know what they mean, you're really not communicating your thought very well, right? Okay, so you don't want to lose your reader. You want it to be your words, your clarity coming through, your voice, your style, but yet you want it done in such a way that your reader is able to follow you, right? That you're not so academic that you're losing people who are trying to read you. Some professions, maybe at an advanced level, there's a lot of vocabulary, and it's expected that you use some really advanced words and concepts. But for most of your writing, what you're after is clarity to communicate well, right? Which implies both ends of the communication. It's not just what you say, it's can they take what you say and understand it, right? Okay. So both sides of communication are important, right? Let me just throw this out there just while we're thinking about style. We're not doing too much with creative writing, but if you do want to do some fictional writing later, and we'll probably offer this as an elective course, when you're thinking about your thought precision, what you're wanting to do is to show your reader, not necessarily tell your reader. Now, sometimes in your homework, right, where you're in a more academic setting, you're just telling, right? You're explaining something. You're telling us what you've learned. You're explaining a concept. If the difference between the academic style and perhaps a fictional style is that in fiction, you can't just tell somebody something all the time. You can't just say, the guy went to the store because he wanted to get this, and then after that, the guy went back to his house because he wanted to go home and watch TV. That's terrible fiction writing. Fiction writing is about showing. The purple car sped into the driveway and slammed on its brakes, and it careened into the parking spot with a flutter of dust. You're showing, not just telling. You're showing, right? So you're using words to show if it's something more like fiction. You're using words to tell if it's something more like academic, right? Okay. Sometimes we think along that same line that higher sounding words carry more weight, right? Often it's the opposite. So if you think of some of the great speeches of all time, let's go with one everybody knows, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. What made that powerful was not big sounding words. It was the simplicity and clarity of the message. I have a dream, right? No big words, right? Very clear, very powerful. Obviously, his delivery style was important. The way he delivered it verbally was important. But the same principle can be carried over into writing. It's not always high-sounding words that cause you to be impactful. Sometimes it is your ability to be concise, powerful, and clear in a short time frame that leaves the most impact.